Hi everyone! A quick note before we launch into today's video. Applications for CADA 5 of our IPSA professional training course are now open for start in September 2022. If you feel that you have a calling towards depth psychology or psychotherapy and would like to train professionally under Steve and Pauline Richards in psychosystems analysis, then you are more than welcome to apply. We really look forward to reading your application. Check the link in the description and pinned comment for the application webpage. Thanks everyone. Now, onto the video. Today's video is a conversation between Steve and Pauline Richards and Professor Erik Goodwyn, MD, covering an enormous bandwidth of topics of supreme importance for the future of psychotherapy. The main theme today is the hero cycle, its origins, its psychodynamic and biological representations, its purpose, and its use clinically to help real-world individuals. Across the runtime, Steve, Pauline, and Professor Goodwyn discuss how the hero cycle manifests differently in both male and female lifespan adaptations, with the same theme of self-sacrifice and death and rebirth. Steve and Pauline's model of Panksepian instincts, meta-instincts, deep structure complexes, and the superposition of information biopsychosocially in the context of archetypes and the hero cycle, including how an individual can access their own meta-instincts properly through hypnotic dissociation. Professor Goodwyn's pioneering work into the representation of innate symbols and metaphors in the psychobiology of the human species, cross-culturally. And Steve and Pauline clarify the essential distinction between fantasy and imagination, and personal and collective myths. Additionally, 3 case studies are presented, 1 from Steve and Pauline and 2 from Professor Goodwyn. Steve and Pauline Richards are the founders of the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis, with over 40 years of clinical experience in depth psychology and clinical psychophysiology each, with their model having been supported by Dr. Anthony Stevens, Professor Ernest Rossi, Professor George Engel, Dr. Peter Nixon, and Franz Jung, Carl Jung's only son. Professor Erik Goodwyn is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Washington and Clinical Faculty at the Billings Clinic, part of the WWAMI University of Washington School of Medicine, Billings, Montana affiliate, Department of Psychiatry and Clerkship for Medical Education at University of Washington and Pacific Northwest University. He is the co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Jungian Studies, and his published books include The Neurobiology of the Gods, How the Brain Shapes the Recurrent Imagery of Myth and Dreams, a psychological reading of the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, Understanding Everything as Story, Healing Symbols in Psychotherapy, a Ritual Approach, Magical Consciousness, co-authored with anthropologist Susan Greenwood, and Understanding Dreams and Other Spontaneous Images, The Invisible Storyteller. In addition, Professor Goodwyn has also authored numerous publications in the field of consciousness studies, Jungian psychology, neuroscience, mythology, philosophy, anthropology, and the psychology of religion. Professor Goodwyn is also on the board at the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis, working with Steve and Pauline to bring psychosystems analysis into the United States. Today's show is absolutely packed with vital information and represents the front lines of the future of psychotherapy. We really hope that you enjoy.
Hello, hello.
Hello,
Hi,
Professor.
Professor.
How are you?
Hi, guys. Good to be back.
Yes, good to see
Yeah,
you.
it's wonderful to see you.
So, what I was thinking is that we could have a discussion about archetypes, because I've been going through some of your theoretical materials. Really interesting stuff.
Thank you.
I really like it a lot. It is, as you said in other videos, it's going a slightly different track.
Yeah.
I think attending to different things. But I think we're kind of looking at the same stuff from different angles. So I definitely, it resonates with me. But in my endless pursuit for conceptual clarity, I wanted to at least share my perspective on how an archetype emerges, and I was going to use the hero archetype as an example. And then I was going to bounce that off of you and have you kind of explain to me, you all tell me how in your model it works in your model.
That'd be great. Be very interested to hear what you have to say on that. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah. Because now, unless I'm mistaken, your description of archetypes, like so many other descriptions of archetypes out there, it seems like we've got 5 theorists talking about archetypes. You get 6 archetype theories. Different, from what everyone else is talking about, and yet it's still kind of grasping at the same sort of thing, I think. But yeah. So by hero archetype, I mean the full hero's journey, right? So like a solar hero who goes on a journey and does all the stuff. Joseph Campbell stuff. All right. And I think we could, and maybe we agree on this. I was thinking that it's pretty easy to demonstrate that pops up all over the world and in various guises. So we're not just cooking this thing up. It's out there. It's a real thing. Of course, the big question in archetype debate is why are these things universal? And I've had all kinds of debates about that. But since you're coming from this from the point of the genomic self, which I absolutely love that idea, by the way, and I'm stealing it. I use it all the time.
Well, you used it anyway for a long time. It was part.
Yeah, it is. It's just I just love the way you frame it. As the self and the genome are really very much equivalent in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But since you ascribe to that, then that means that you are looking at this from a point of view of a biological imperative. Right? The hero archetype is it's in the genome somehow. Encoded at least in some way, right?
Yeah. I mean, we take this superpositional model as well, which is a way of incorporating some of your other ideas. Actually, I think, from what I understand, cosmopsychism, or that they co-occur and are necessary for one another, so they are found together. And in that sense, I don't see a problem. For me, a genomic perspective is simply collapsing into a biological framework to understand something that includes that, but is more. And then
right, it's not only the genome, but I mean it's a big piece of the puzzle.
Oh, it's huge, absolutely. Yeah. And I like the way you frame the hero's journey as an archetype, which means the scenario is, the narrative is, the situation is, rather than collapsing it into a reified figure.
Yes.
I feel that is really important with respect to the people that we've worked with.
Okay.
Because
so then what you're saying is that for you, an archetype is not an image per se, like a particular character, but more of and this is the way I describe it too, as a form. Yeah. It's a structure which gets filled in with different pieces and parts from our own experience, but then so the structure is what is inherited, not so much the actual particular story necessarily.
Yeah, I would say that the Jungian-based concept of an archetype, even if we take it away from the fact that was generated by him in the context of his life and his own personality,
right,
is something which is real, but it's a collapsed observation which reduces many things that are simultaneously present into a level of representation that we can resonate with, but it's not limited to that. So for us, in that sense, then the archetype is biological, it's an informational field as well, and it's a narrative within which reified characters are embedded, and fundamentally all of this is anticipated, and it unfolds. That's how I see for example, the hero's journey. That for me, as I understand it, is something which is innate and is released, and we see it in children's play. We see the rehearsal for these things. Young boys rehearse war before they know what war is. It's natural.
Right.
And,
Sure.
and they go through the self-sacrifice in games of dying and being reborn. They demonstrate in a game they're prepared to die for their friends, and then they get up again and everyone thinks he's wonderful and he's a hero. And you see that, and then that's acted out later. So something is rehearsing it.
Sure.
That information is stored at the beginning and is released in a rehearsed sense before it becomes actualized in reality. And then downstream of that, we get the same information in the culture represented in novels, myths, and so forth. Sorry, that was just a potted
well, it's the same. It's the same for girls as well, isn't it? Playing with dolls and in that sense rehearsing motherhood, which obviously is a form of self-sacrifice in a way, because there's a move away from one state into another and becoming a mother. So you see it in both sexes, don't you? Just playing out in different ways.
Yeah, and if you, I was going to say, if you look at groups of boys and girls playing, and you give them both a castle with characters, the girls will have little dramas between the king, the queen, and the princess, and the boys will have monsters attacking from outside and the warriors at the battlements shooting at them. That kind of says a lot right there.
I was just going to ask Paul, would you say then that given the high risk of childbirth and carrying, that there is a heroic element to being a mother, particularly in a non-contemporary, non-modern environment? Pretty much up until recently, there was a high risk of death.
Oh, there was,
and there is a self-sacrifice, and the rebirth is being reborn into being a mother, which is another state of woman.
Yes.
Is that what you?
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. And obviously, like you say, Steve, the risks in the mother probably isn't as great as it used to be. But I think there's an element to not only of being pregnant but giving birth that has a there's a need for strength and endurance, really, just to get through that process, which, as you say, is not without risk, but it's nonetheless transformative. I mean, becoming a mother obviously changes you completely, even just at the point at which you give birth, and then obviously it's a process from there on as well that develops. But just that process in and of itself is definitely something of a heroic act, I would say.
So there's a death of the previous state of not being a mother,
true.
Then a ritual and a biological contemporaneous transition, and then you're reborn into being a mother. Makes sense.
The sacrifices of motherhood don't end at birth.
They don't. That's absolutely true. Yes, for sure. Yes, it's just the beginning, isn't it, of many? Yes. Yeah.
So when I was years ago, and I was really kind of putting together my understanding of archetypes, I always wanted to start with the images and try to work backwards to find out why it is that they all have these structural components to them. So that's where the angle I came at it from. And so what I've come up with so far then is that there are a number of archetypal associations that everyone is kind of born with. They're innate in the sense that they inevitably emerge in every person. And I don't want to go down the nature versus nurture baloney, right? Because we know that there's really no such thing as independent of the environment or independent of the genome, right? Everything works together. The question is how robust does something emerge, right? And if it emerges in everyone, well, then there's probably a strong genomic reason for that. So then what I've come up with then is a set, kind of an alphabet, if you will, of symbols that we all get through the course of development. Probably no later than age 5, but maybe earlier than that. That part I haven't worked out exactly, but but I want to run a few of them by you and to see if they kind of resonate. Like,
yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so like, and I think we've talked about some of this before, but like the symbolic association between knowledge, safety, and the manifest and light is ubiquitous because of, and these I can also explain all of these too as why it's innate. So like that is very simple. It's based on the vision system. The fact that we're diurnal creatures. If we were rats, we wouldn't associate safety and knowledge with light. We would associate it with darkness because they're safer when they're dark. They run away from the light, right? So, but we're not rats. Most of us aren't. And then the opposite of that would be the unknown and the unmanifest and dark and danger are dark. Okay, so that's just one, right? So I got a bunch of them. Power, strength, and rulership is symbolized as high position. And I think that can be equated with our vertical orientation, like we upright walk posture, and how if we're knocked down, then we're much more vulnerable. So we're going to think of power in that sense. It's an easy way to symbolize it.
Yeah.
So weakness and slavery are low positions. Every person is going to get this. Doesn't matter what culture you're raised in. I think, in fact, that if you took a bunch of people and stick them on Mars and completely separate them from all media representations, they would still come up with all of these.
Yeah.
Conviviality is warmth. Loneliness is cold. That's tied to our temperature regulation systems that from which evolved our social like attachment systems. Passion is fire and death is ice. Same kind of thing. When we're intensely affective, we know from affective neuroscience that blood pressure and temperature increase. So again, anyone with a normal human physiology could come up with that connection. Perfection would be symmetry and balance. Imperfection, asymmetry. And that's embedded in our visual system that prefers symmetrical configurations in mates, because there's that whole business about genetic, if you have a lot of genetic mutations, you have an asymmetrical body. And so, evolution says, well, then you're going to seek out those that are more symmetrical, right? Analysis is like dividing things into parts. So that's a metaphor that shows up everywhere. Complex, intentful processes are people. That's just personification. 2-year-olds do that. Kind of like when I remember when my granddaughter was walking and she tripped over the leg of a table and she turned to the table and said, "Bad." Like the table intended for that to happen, right? Theory of mind. But, yeah, that's right. It's a theory of mind, exactly. So a few more. Development in time is the same thing. Is symbolized as a journey along a path, right? Love is a journey. I talk about that in Neurobiology of the Gods. An ideological conflict is a physical confrontation. It's a fight. Lakoff and Johnson talked about this in Metaphors We Live By, if you're familiar with that book. Great book.
I'm not personally familiar, but I have.
Oh, okay. It came out in the 1980s. It was a philosopher and a linguist. Very influential book, Metaphors We Live By. A lot of it's in Neurobiology of the Gods, because I noticed the same thing they did when they looked at language and the way we use metaphors all the time. Yeah. We can't even get away from it.
Can I just offer something there, Professor? Interesting, that's 1980. That's the year Milton Erickson died, and his main vehicle for communication in hypnosis was metaphor.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, because it has a bandwidth that's much wider than verbal.
It does.
Communication. At least straightforward, like semantic meaning. If you include symbolic meaning in that, which a lot of times we do unintentionally, it bypasses, right? It goes straight to the affect.
It does. Yeah. We deliberately utilize it in that way.
Yeah. So then my last one would be a developmental obstacle would be a monster. That's another personification, and a vaguely defined hostile creature is going to be a connection that anyone can make. All right. So what's the point? So I say we all come into the world with these ready-made in the imagination. So whenever the imagination needs them to symbolize something in a dream or whatever, then it'll use them all. So then if we take a conflict, if we combine these, right, we can take a complex intentful process that's oriented towards knowledge, power, and conviviality and balance. A great way to symbolize that is a solar being, a solar hero or God, demigod, because it embodies all of those things in the image, right? And these are using innate metaphors. Okay, so then so then I guess the next question is, okay, under what circumstances would this thing pop up in the imagination? And I think that it's when it's an environmentally triggered response that calls for some kind of psychological transition. And I want to see if this resonates with you guys. So it's basically a transition from separation, weakness, and slavery through interactions of ideological conflicts and obstacles toward a position of conviviality, knowledge, power, and balance. That's the hero's journey. So if the psyche or the genome, really, if the genome detects an environmental situation, says, okay, the organism that I'm in is not doing so hot, right? This person is just not getting there. I need to boil this down into where we need to go. And the intent forward-looking process generates this imagery as a natural instinctive response. So like one of the things I noticed in your writings, in your handouts, are that you make a harder distinction, I think, between the instinct and the image. And Jung makes this distinction, but then it kind of gets lost a lot of times in his writings. It gets mushed together. And it's actually really, I think, important, because the instinct is a behavior. It's not an image, but it leads to, I think, the images.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about all that so far? Like, how does a hero's journey emerge in your system?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. Of course, I think and your observations upon which your reasoning is based is absolutely accurate. And I can't disagree with it at all. I mean, like you said, we use sometimes different language for arriving at the same place.
Yeah.
Because we have this superpositional model of information, then we consider things are in several places at the same time. And the observation, which defines the level that we make the observation at, in other words, a system.
So you're using a quantum mechanics kind of metaphor of the observer effect, collapse of the wave function, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, but we part company in the sense that we don't think, because this is contrary to observation, that things collapse only into one state and others are deleted. You know, they're all there. What collapses is the observation and not the phenomenon. That's the difference. And this is where a lot of psychological theories, in our view, make mistakes, because they collapse into a dogmatic interpretation or a reductive one. But for us, the image can be described as being separate, and the thing in and of itself, if we think in a Jungian sense, could be described as something in and of itself, but they're both there. And to tease them apart in terms of what's actually happening overall is reductive to absurdity, in the sense that the outcome of that is necessarily broken. So the image, we think, can operate independently, say, of the instinct. And I call it a meta instinct for the sake of our particular approach rather than an archetype. Because the image is capable of acting independently, because when we take it as a level of analysis, description, and explanation, we can see that it appears to do that, and that can cause people to become reductive about it. So it appears functionally sometimes to act independently of the instinct in and of itself. Then we have to consider why that might be the case, what's causing the observation. And it could be that the image becomes invested with, for metaphorical sake, energy at a particular level in order to emphasize the quality of the image. In other words, the image is sometimes more important than the thing in and of itself, because the image in effect is that which can be apperceived or perceived by the ego when it either looks in or receives the information which is represented by the image.
Okay, hold on. Okay, time out. So then let me see if I got you right here. So like the way I described how the image emerges is this, just really kind of the beginning of the process for you. You're saying once the image emerges, then there's a host of things that happen beyond that. One of which can be that the image kind of takes a life of its own.
It appears to.
Or it appears to, and that the ego, I guess, dependent, and that makes sense, because if the ego takes that and says, I'm the hero, right, and identifies with it, and it becomes just wish fulfillment, really, or power fantasy, complex, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So we would regard what the Jungians call an archetypal image as being a dialectical product of information moving in two different directions, and then settling on something which has purpose and functionality. But at that level, it's capable of emitting and changing itself again in response to changes in the environment. So that would explain local variations in archetypal images internally, because it's reacting to the outside and the genome and the instincts, more broadly the meta instincts. And so this is being updated continually.
So there's inner and outer modification going on at the same time.
Yeah, simultaneously.
Yes.
And that means that if we accept that, we're forced to consider the outer and the inner simultaneously as being connected. And if we make the wrong observation, we split them off, and then we get problems.
So what would be, give me a concrete example of that process happening?
Well, I'd have to introduce another element, which is what we call a deep structure complex, which the way that I ask people, or we ask people to think about this, is that it's a kind of a force experiment model. And I know they have their problems, because if you introduce a force experiment, it's a suggestion. You start from a premise and say, follow this, and people do. Well, yeah, you get to the answer that you were looking for, but these things seem to be real. And it's this, that it's another kind of dialectical structure, which is below or upstream of the image rather than downstream in terms of information processing, that emerges on the basis of experience that the genome has of the ego. It's an opinion.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
Janus-faced. It has one face that points to the ego, and it has one which points to the meta instincts, which is the wider narrative, to which it has a figure-ground relationship. Now,
okay, so you're saying that the image that emerges in this case, is, say it's a dream, for example, is not only an embodiment of perhaps where the genome thinks the person needs to go, but it's also a reflection of how the ego has been behaving up to this point.
Yes, and this is I believe is the origin of the Narcissus myth, and not as it's currently represented or was represented within Greece, but there's an intuition behind that when we look in, we see ourselves first. So from the perspective of the ego, then there's this process we call internal projection. That
I remember you working, talking about that.
The first thing it will see is an image of itself reflected back, but it's actually in part an image which is agreed with by the unconscious, and the instincts, the genome. It says, yeah, this is you as we see you. But what we really are is the other side of that image, and you can't see that yet, because all you can see is this internal image of yourself. And if we get fixated by that, we don't get any further. And at that point, there's a multiplication possible of these different facets of image, because the genome, the unconscious, the instincts, however we want to conceive of that, will react to every way, every change the ego makes. There's another entangled change with this image. It just responds. You're looking for the anima. Okay, here's the anima. You haven't heard of the anima. Okay, what have you heard of? The id. Okay, I'm the id, because you believe in the id, and that's what you see. And there's a functional element to that, because it says that if you see yourself, we will bond, and that activation hierarchy, that chain of communication will be open. But then the obverse has to happen. And then you go into the true narrative, which is the ancient anticipated story, if you like, or preparation. But first of all, we see our fictions, we see the narcissistic internal projection of the ego. Otherwise, it would have no way of, where am I? Because the ego is all external. If it doesn't take a model or representation of the external world into the inside, it is lost, it loses itself immediately. So we find these deep structure complexes exist, they work with the image, but it's not the thing in and of itself.
So that's what's going on with the myth of Narcissus falling in love with his own reflection, is because you're saying it's kind of a depiction of looking inwardly, just seeing a reflection. But of course, that's just the surface. There's all this stuff underneath it, but you're not seeing any of that. You're just seeing the surface reflection.
The actual reflection.
That's a great metaphor.
The reflection is in a pool of water. Water is an ecology. It's an environment. If we
it's a whole host of stuff going on down there, and you're not seeing any of it.
Yeah, it's analogous. So if narcissist falls in and doesn't drown, then he's in another environment. He's in another ecology, and that's the same with the unconscious. If you go in and don't drown because the ego is dissolved, if it takes a sense of identity with it, which is firm enough, it can get past its projections, and then the deep structure complex turns into a psychopomp and says, "Follow me." And this is where we get the fairy tale of riddles. When we meet somebody in a fairy tale or in folklore and we're asked the riddle, can you answer the question? So the deep structure complex is also what we would call a port reeve, a guardian for the door, metaphorically.
It's like the three-headed dog.
Yeah, Cerberus.
Yeah. So in my book on dream interpretation, Understanding Dreams, I talk about how the imagination has really two masters. One is the ego, and the other one is the not ego. And that sometimes it's tough to tell the difference of like who's running the show. Like in a dream, it's mostly unconscious, unless it's a lucid dream, of course, which gets really muddy waters.
Yeah.
But it can be a lot tougher for things like active imagination or, just reverie. Yeah. How much of it is the ego directing the narrative of the imaginary journey, whatever it is. Yeah. Now, and I noticed that when you're talking about this stuff, it's kind of a sidebar, but you talk about that internal projection being a major problem. Yeah. In trying to figure out, like in active imagination, a lot of times you just get lost in complexes and you don't really see anything genuinely from the unconscious. Yeah. Or the genome, or anything forward looking, because it's all contaminated by the ego. Is just trying to create this scenario that it likes. Yeah. Okay. So it sounds to me like we're talking the same language. We're talking about the same phenomena there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've noticed that too. So, since I haven't used hypnosis techniques to, I think, purify the field, as it were, because it sounds like that's what you're doing, right? You down modulate the ego to the point where you're just getting raw material, and you don't have to wait for a dream report, which can be messy and half forgotten and all that kind of thing, right? And you're getting more direct communication from the genomic self and so forth.
That can happen, but you have to build a place for the ego to be where it can be objective about itself, which means it has to turn down cognition and affect, which is difficult. Because the first thing that happens then, isn't it, is that as you say, the complexes, they power up, and we see the background consciousness the complexes have and is present all the time comes to the surface, and then are we attached to that or not? And this is where the East can help. At this level, the Eastern perspective of, say, a tantric Buddhist view on what goes on when we go inside has value. I do think it runs out, but it does have value initially.
Okay. So then, in getting back to their hero's journey, right? So the hero's journey is, just maybe for anyone out there listening who doesn't remember exactly, it's a person hears a call to action, they travel into the unknown, they battle monsters, they're engulfed, but they persevere through that. They overcome the monsters and acquire great treasures, and then they become a mighty hero that dwells on high and is compared with the sun. That's the hero's journey. I think that this narrative, now stepping aside a minute from all of those complications that can happen that you're describing here, which I absolutely agree with, the kernel of the idea is the thing that's inherited, right? The structure, and the genome will try to use it, but then the ego can get in the way sometimes and get lost in all that stuff. But ultimately, since a lot of what my writing is at the more basic level, because I'm still dealing with skeptics that don't believe in archetypes and stuff like that, and I'm like, come on, and all that, right? And then there's the folks that have so much problem with biological contribution, right? And I'm with you. I don't want to reduce everything to biology, but I also don't want to pretend like it's not there, or in your term, collapse everything into psychology. That's just as bad of a mistake.
It's probably worse, actually.
Yeah. But sometimes it's worse, because then anything can mean anything, and you can get completely lost in all that. But so the environmental conditions that trigger that hero's journey, though, I think are probably, and just kind of clinically what I've seen is, you'll see this, a lot of times you'll see this in therapy, because therapy itself is a call to action and forward momentum and development and all that. But just any situation really that the ego or development is stymied, I think will evoke this narrative. And from there you go to, and a lot of times it's social situations that evoke this too. And that's the social piece. And so then I think what happens is it's generated. Now, what I've been focusing on, what you're focusing on, is the nitty gritty. Like, how does this work in the trenches with the people that you're working with, right? Which makes perfect sense, because you guys are in that clinical work. I've been trying to describe exactly how it emerges in the first place. And based on other basic sciences, can we show that this happens? And definitely, I think so. Those innate symbolic associations by probably around age 5 or so, we're capable of producing these image narratives with self insertions into them, right? So we're cognitively able to do that. So then we'll be able to. And then the imagination, whose function in my mind is to answer the question, who am I? Basically, it's collapses all of this sensory information and organizes it into a symbolic narrative. If it doesn't have a whole lot of symbolism in it, it's memory. If you include the symbolic element, it's a dream. But dreams contain the most amount of dense information, and so they are the kind of high level consolidation for this.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that.
Yeah. And so then they need the emotional kick to get this process going. Like, you need some kind of emotional affective situation. And then the imagination uses those tools to organize the narrative. Yeah. But then what you're describing is everything that happens then from that point, right? So like, they have this narrative, but then what do we do with it in therapy? Do we examine and see, how are they relating, I guess, is more the question, right? So the ego, how does the ego relate? So that's my picture of how a archetypal image such as the hero's journey emerges. But there's reading your material, there's some steps in there, other steps, like you go from instincts to meta instincts and all that. I was wondering if maybe you can kind of walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. The Panksepian instincts are obviously a priori, because they're older than the human species.
Older than Homo sapiens by far, yes.
Yeah. So any species, firstly, with a similar brain structure will have them. But any species,
so mammals.
Yeah, but a similar limbic system and brainstem, basically, and structurally.
Yeah,
those things are important, aren't
they? They are, absolutely. But then there's also any species which has a similar drive to survive and to fulfill its genomic potential will have some of those to some level of representation.
Sure.
And neuropsychoanalysis focuses on them, and I think they've done a wonderful job. Mark Solms, obviously, and the late Jaap Panksepp, fantastic job. But if they were to operate minus a context, they would be a collapsed biologically reductive model, which would say, as they do say, that the purpose of the Panksepian instincts is to extend homeostasis beyond biology. The limits of what I can do with my body has to become behavior.
Yeah.
But if there's no context for that behavior, there's a problem. And what we see in neurosis is that very often there is no context for the pressure coming from the Panksepian instincts, and therefore the genome behind them.
Okay, yeah.
Because the meta-narrative isn't in place, or it's been compromised in some way. But the energy and the information is still present, whether they're conscious of it or not. We would normally say they're conscious of it or not. We would say there is a consciousness, because we define consciousness differently to most depth psychologists. But because it's an informational representation, that has a complexity of structure, purpose, function, and communication. It's there. We're not aware of its ego-wise, so we call it unconscious. The result of that is instinctive pressure to act out the narrative in the most adapted way possible. That's coming from the genome. That's lifespan development driven, but Panksepian instincts push from behind those as well. And it gets complicated because all of these things suddenly add up, and then people are in a hell of a mess and they don't know where to go. And I like how you talk about imagination. We for example, use that and contrast it with fantasy, with a special meaning, which we know is a different one to other people. But we would take fantasy to be a Freudian thing, to do with something which is not real, which is generated as a holding space for acting out or to duct or divert lifespan development instinctive pressure into. Whereas imagination is something at the very minimum, at an instinctive level, is Panksepian seeking system. It's pushing to achieve in the world, but it goes further than that, as you rightly say, because when imagination in the form of seeking to reduce pressure and have a good homeostasis biologically meets a meta instinct, whoa, that it powers out. And then the result downstream of that is a cultural representation of the same pressure, which might be localized and therefore become a Greek myth, or a Norwegian, Danish, Scandinavian Viking myth, or a Celtic myth, or a Chinese or an Indian myth, or whatever. It's the same process powering from within.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, imagination is preferable to fantasy, really, isn't it? For that reason. And you know, we often find too that fantasy tends to be connected more to complexes, and imagination to meta instincts or archetypes. So you know, imagination is preferable really to fantasy. We have a lot of, we find the extent to which the young people we work with are immersed in fantasy, we find that problematic, don't we, usually?
We do. There's a direct correlation with the power of complexes with respect to their life, insofar as what they're doing to interfere with adaptation. The complexes become parasitical, and then it's as if they've generated a fantasy space, and the instincts get caffected into that and contained by the complex, so it feeds the complex, which is the maladaptation. Whereas imagination propels you beyond. But also, because it looks backwards, imagination, into the genome and the ancestry, it brings that forward, and that's a terrific amount of developmental pressure. I agree with what you say about symbols. The symbols become images which are high bandwidth, collapsed metaphors which are pushed at us to understand. But if they get pushed into fantasy, it's lost.
So what you're saying is that, so just for clarity for anyone listening, for the dozens of people out there listening, so we've got, you're framing the imagination as something separate from fantasy. And I like that distinction, because it is speaking to the same distinction I'm making as stuff coming from the unconscious versus stuff coming from the ego, right? And that blurs, I'm ignoring the distinction that there is some unconscious element to the ego. I agree with that. But anyway, the way I've been using the word imagination really is just in the generic sense. It's cooking up stuff that I see in my head, wherever it's coming from. But there is an important developmental distinction between if it's coming from an place of undirected fantasy or undirected imagination, undirected imagery, versus directed. And that the imagination used in that sense, when I said a minute ago that the function of the imagination, I was really talking more about the unconsciously derived, because what most people don't realize is that our memory is almost all imagination. And we don't store memories, we create them on the spot. And we don't even recreate them. It just, we direct it, and it's, I need to retrieve what happened to me yesterday, so it just cooks up what happened to me yesterday, and it happens to be usually kind of okayly accurate. But dreams take memory consolidation and then overlay a symbolic narrative behind it and say it's as if my life has progressed up to my point as like this. So that's kind of the distinction. But what you're saying then is that there's also this kind of malicious process where the ego is involved with it, because we have the ability to conjure up narratives of any sort that we want by daydreaming. Right? So that's what I would call that, daydreaming.
Yeah.
And if you look at stuff like the neuroscientific work of Alan Hobson, and maybe you're familiar with some of that.
Yeah, I know him, Alan Hobson.
Yeah, okay, Hobson, and he loves to troll Freudians. But anyway, so he talks about how there's a spectrum between daydreaming and full-blown, like, not, rapid eye movement dreaming.
Yeah.
In terms of how much it's directed by the willful ego, or the will, say. But if you can't figure out a way to tell how much of whatever it is that they're producing for you is directed by the ego, then you're going to potentially run into problems. And when you say, Pauline, when you say that so much fantasy people can get lost in that.
Yeah.
Would you agree then the problem is that the ego is forcing it into a particular narrative that it wants, and a lot of that stuff, I would say, is driven by power complexes and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think definitely. And what we tend to see typically is that young people do attach themselves to collective myths in the culture, and as a result of that, they're steered away from the through line of their own life and their own personal myth and their own personal journey, and that can be very distracting, because what it tends to do is that it tends to reveal rather than conceal, or to conceal rather than reveal what is going on for that person. So whilst the collective myth can close in on an individual's personal myth and point them in the right direction, which of course can be helpful, we tend to find that more often than not that it's distracting in nature, and it moves people towards falling foul of things like neurotic alibis and guiding fictions and the like, and then they don't really get to solve anything that's happening for them. So that's the way in which we find that it goes awry for people when they're too attached to.
Okay, so I've got two examples, clinical examples for you that come to mind. So the first one is, and I've had permission to use this in didactic material. So one of them was a woman that I treated one time who was, she would have these fantasies of Joan of Arc going up from, like in a cloud of thunder, and sweeping in to, take on all comers. Whereas in her like everyday work environment or home life, she would often get embroiled in these sorts of conflicts with other people that were really basically, like at work, for example, she would be getting into conflicts with people over what they were doing in terms of like, they're doing this thing at work, and it's it's kind of questionable, although I can't really call it into question because I'm not their boss, but I'm going to get into this conflict with them anyway, and all this kind of stuff. So we came to see Joan of Arc as kind of the guiding image, and she really at first was like, oh, that's really kind of cool, and there was this tendency to want to try to identify with that, and I'm like, hold on now, wait a minute, remember what happened to Joan of Arc? Okay, that's kind of an important part of that story. She got burned at the stake.
Yeah.
Maybe you can draw inspiration, right? You can call on her when needed or something like that, but you are not her, right? And so that was how I handled that situation with that. And then we worked from there on term, like we would use that imagery frequently. Because it was a great way to encapsulate a whole lot of stuff that was going on in her life. The unconscious produced that imagery, but then the ego grabbed it and initially and tried to do other stuff with it. This is how I saw it anyway.
Well, I think
how would you describe that interaction?
Well, I would probably do a similar thing to yourself, in so much as I think you're rightly pointing out there was clearly a risk of inflation by identifying with the historical character herself, and as you also say, you because it's symbolic, it's got this broad bandwidth of information that you can draw from to then help somebody at a personal level, and then sort of shrink it down to a manageable size, and allow that person then to go out into life and to act in the world in a productive way and in an informed way, without, you know, the obvious dangers of identifying with such a big idea as that. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do, and we were probably...
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad. But well, I was just want to mention briefly, I was surprised at how accurate that, I mean, how any character from any story anywhere could have popped up at that moment. Why, I always ask myself, like, why Joan of Arc specifically? Why not some other hero?
Yeah.
And it was the whole aspect of taking on the establishment, even though you're not really a part of it and not a figure of authority.
Yeah.
And that's, which is what she did, what the actual character of Joan of Arc did. Yeah. And that seemed to resonate. It was like the unconscious was saying, "This is what you're doing."
Yes. Well,
yes,
in an everyday sense, it is a heroic thing, a heroic act to take on you know, other people who maybe you don't agree with, and it requires a certain amount of, you arguably, moral courage to do that as well. So
yeah, absolutely, nothing wrong with it necessarily, but it was very accurate. I think I was thinking later, a couple of years later actually, that Don Quixote would have been another appropriate character, but it wouldn't contain the aspect of being burned to death.
Yeah.
No. So, can I just...
And that's an important detail, which is probably why the unconscious picked Joan of Arc and not Don Quixote.
Yeah, I agree with obviously with both you guys. My instincts, if I can call it that, would be to receive what was said and to notice, but not pursue it initially. What I would do is want to know what the person's unconscious mind thinks of that, because sometimes something which has become a neurotic alibi or a guiding fiction in an Adlerian sense, a compensation for a situation like that, sits very comfortably for a person, but they're so attached to it they don't move. Yes. So I would do what I normally do initially anyway. I would establish a rapport of the psyche and build up a channel of communication for an opinion on that. I wouldn't attempt to understand
interpret it.
Certainly wouldn't over-interpret it. I wouldn't try and undervalue it, devalue it.
Yeah, of course, right. Don't reduce it.
But I'd be looking for what is perhaps being compensated beyond the text, if you like, of the version of the story that the person lives. For example, Joan of Arc was betrayed. That's why she died. She's betrayed by her own side, and that's an element that she may be aware of, may not be aware of.
Right.
If she's not, that's interesting. I can give an example from today. I spoke to someone today who has found the image of Rasputin turning up in their life. Mm-hmm. And the context of that is, it on the surface is Rasputin, and then it went like that. And that was very interesting, because Rasputin, as you know, was a very powerful, charismatic figure. But he was done to death.
Scary guy.
He was done to death.
Yes.
Probably because he inflated and didn't believe, he thought all the pieces on the board were in place. So the inflation, this guy isn't inflated because he's got the insight to be able to deal with it. But the potential for inflation troubled him when he realized, and it did come from within, and it was interesting how it came from within. There was an internal experience and an external correlation, which was synchronistic. The internal experience was the perception, like a flash, that there was something wrong with the idea of Rasputin that perhaps was threatening to him.
Yeah.
In the external world, a whole bunch of synchronicities collided and collapsed into a sequence which confirmed the image of Rasputin. And so it's that means the superpositioning of information is internal and external, with his ego in the middle, sandwiched. And the flash of insight that this is a warning downstream of where he might go meant that the Rasputin story was a meta instinct that projected an image of itself into consciousness, but potentially also through synchronicity into the environment, and then it came back at him. so that's an ongoing thing. But this guy is a colleague, so, and I know there's no problem with me discussing it. So there's no betrayal and there's no identification of who he is or anything like that.
Right.
But that's whenever I hear a myth like that, I want to know, what does the unconscious think of the myth that the ego is living with?
Yes.
And then I thought, I can't burst the bubble, so what I have to do is to build a safety net of ego strength and contact and rapport with the person, so their unconscious trusts the therapeutic process enough for us to be able to monitor it. And then if there is the kind of thing that you describe underneath it, which was obviously there, and it was a great insight and understanding about that, then we can maybe nurture her away from attachments to that, in case there's a perseveration of that myth that actually leads her into a point where she betrays herself by inflating. And then
gets burned at the stake.
Then the metaphorical burning might occur, and therapy may contribute to the inflation. If we confirm the myth, we might confirm the full acting out of it.
Yeah.
So that's just the way I sometimes think about things.
Yeah, I mean, often in mythology and in alchemy, you know, the idea of burning can mean many things, obviously. And you know, sometimes it can be the fire of annihilation, you know, as in being burnt at the stake, and sometimes it's burning as in something being transformative. I mean, you mentioned Cerberus earlier, and that made me think, obviously, of the 12 labors of Hercules. And at the end of the story, Heracles sacrifices himself on a funeral pyre. The idea being that, you know, as the human flesh is burnt away, it releases the soul of something of the essence of the man. And so in that sense, it's a transcendent moment, a transcendent experience. So so many ways, I think it could be that you could, that you could work with that.
Yeah. The only way to differentiate it is the context, like under what other circumstances are going on to lean us one direction or the other. Because that's how condensed the symbols are. They can mean both yes and no, and we're kind of lost until we get that sorted out.
Yeah, and that's why the personal element is so important ultimately, and you know, the personal myth, it has to be more important ultimately than the collective myth. I mean, another example would be, say, Alexander the Great, whose collective myth was that of the Iliad, but then in his own personal life, his own achievements were so great that it well exceeded any kind. Yes, it did.
That's a great example. No pun intended. Because I mean, who accomplished more than Alexander the Great, right? Few people.
And they were
Genghis Khan, maybe. Then, you know, it's not exactly a wonderful thing either, all that conquest and carnage.
He achieved his own at a young age too, and
32.
He actually decided that it was okay, that he was prepared to do that. If he would be the stuff of future memory, he was prepared to have a short but glorious life, and to outdo Achilles. That was his. You know, Achilles was his hero, so I can outdo him. I'll be remembered forever.
And he has been, hasn't he?
He has,
really.
Achilles is myth, and Alexander's remembered as a fact.
That's true.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So there, the danger of inflation when you're working with these stories is high. I'm working with my residents. I tell them that this is like working with explosives, right? You got to be careful in your laboratory, right? I think I stole that from Edinger. I think he used that. Be cautious. So here's my other example, right? So I had a vet when I was in the Air Force. I treated a guy for a year, and he had severe PTSD, multiple combats, multiple awards for valor. Wow. He physically was extremely intimidating. He was massive muscles, and he worked out all the time. But I just had crippling PTSD. And through the course, long story short, many of his dreams involved extremely heroic characters, but the fact that he was constantly fighting this enemy that he couldn't defeat. He was shooting this character who would keep getting up, and no matter how many times he fought him, And there was this continuous theme of anything that shows up, his solution is to attack it and beat the crap out of it or shoot it or whatever. But the psyche set it up to where he was always at the disadvantage. Like the weapons didn't work, or the enemy had bigger guns or whatever. And I always tell my residents, don't get all Freudian about the guns here. This is not necessarily about that. It's about being unprepared and being outmaneuvered or outgunned or whatever. And so the idea of the hero actually ended up being kind of toxic for this guy. But it would be easy to look at that and say, well, he got caught up in this idea of being a invulnerable hero. Yes. And so after having all these traumas, he was not allowed to express things like fear or grief or any of that stuff, because that was weak and we can't have that. And that was certainly there. And he got a lot better once he was able to open up about those kinds of things with me. But I've always thought it's easy to dismiss that and say, well, it's just all inflation and the ego, the getting caught up with the idea of the hero is bad. But it helped him get through what he got through, right? I mean, there was a reason why he had all those awards for valor, and kind of like talking about Alexander the Great. There's an incredible amount of power that goes into those things, and the inflation is a danger, but it exists for a reason too, because it works. Yeah. And what we had to do was help him to adjust to a world where he no longer had to be the great hero. He didn't have to be Superman anymore. Yes. And that was an adjustment, right? I mean, who wants to not be Superman, right? And just be regular Clark Kent all the time. That's boring, but that's what you got to do sometimes.
That's the problem with polarities, because Clark Kent and Superman are a polarity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that we could go down that road.
Yes, it sounds like you built in room for imperfection, which is so important, and that sort of makes me think about, say, the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, and the Order of Imperfect Man, and the fact that despite the fact that he was a hero, he knew also too that he was flawed, and it was important that he, even if nobody else knew about that he could live with that imperfection on the inside, and therefore basically square the two. The heroism and the imperfection at the same time.
Yeah, and that's a great.
But that's obviously how you help this particular guy with the PTSD.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Be that way. Yeah.
Well, and another thing that we ended up having to do a lot was to help him understand his rage.
Yes.
Because he would, again, a polarity existed for him where he would either be at home, paranoid, having panic attacks, constantly having to clean, or the slightest thing would set him off and he'd be enraged and he would go into what he called Terminator mode. Yeah. Right. Which I think he kind of had these strong complexes that were just bouncing the ego back and forth and smacking it around, really. Just kind of on the one hand, he was this sort of invulnerable berserker. And on the other hand, he was this wounded, terrified man. Yeah. And not a whole lot of middle ground there. I ended up using the metaphor of a dimmer switch for his emotions. He said, we got to figure out how to get your emotions on a dimmer switch, right? But it was important for me to validate, though, that the rage was there for a good reason. Because he had previously encountered folks who would sort of treat that as the enemy, right? Let's therapize that away, right? Which, as you, of course, know, it does not work. You can't just magically poof it away. It just gets, stuck in a corner somewhere and come out later when you don't want it to. But once we were able to come to a place where he felt like, okay, the reason why I would get enraged is because it helped me survive being bombed or shot at hundreds of times. Literally, this guy survived so many of these. His military police and our security forces and the Air Force. And, going through all that, you kind of need that stuff. You need the hero character to show up and say, you can be this guy, right? You can be Achilles or whatever it is. Yeah. But then it kind of outlives its usefulness when you're no longer engaged in all that. Yeah. And that was the challenge, the transition. I saw that a lot when I was treating vets. Yeah. And active duty folks.
So there was a change of meta instinct context, and he was out of kilter with that to some extent. And where he was a warrior, he wasn't able to complete that scenario fully, and that was partially described by being in the state of post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a change in his context, and his instincts were out of kilter with his ego, with his identity about himself. And then the Panksepian ones are pushing from behind that to try to complete the narrative he's moved out of. So he would need another one, or a transitional narrative which made sense of him and confirmed him and moved him on. Perhaps from what you said, I've worked with a few military, obviously not as many as you. I've worked with quite a few, and I found that that's an important thing. Is
absolutely
self-concept.
Oh yeah.
So they feel there's continuity, and it's okay to move from one to the other. The psyche does seem to like that. It doesn't like it when we refer back to something which was traumatic, but we survive, but we repeat it. It doesn't like that. It pushes, and that's when people feel the distress, it seems, downstream.
Yeah. Well, and I've often reflected on this with, like I know you have an interest in the history and like ancient warrior cultures and all that sort of stuff. It's really interesting because, I've always wondered, like, did Viking raiders have PTSD? I'm like, I doubt it, because their whole system was oriented around that, and they would come home and they had this very kind of ritualistic process of sharing the story and framing it in a glorious and heroic light and all that kind of thing. And, here's all this treasure I got, and all that kind of thing. And so it created and maybe in your terminology, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it would be a new kind of meta narrative surrounding.
It would. You get that Venn diagram with several of them overlapping and producing a pattern which is appropriate for the moment. So there'll be elements of one meta instinct scenario still active, then another one, and it produces this strange pattern which then opens up. But one of the things I think about the hero cycle is it's a bit of it's a terrible thing, because it's as if the genome collectively is prepared to push individuals to sacrifice themselves. And children do it. They get and they die, and then they get up. But your patient, if he died, he wouldn't have got up.
No.
And it's the mismatch between the preparation and the push of instincts to make a sacrifice for the wider gene pool, whether they're related or it's cultural or whatever it might be, whatever reason he feels motivated and instinctively driven. The mismatch between the childhood rehearsal and the actuality can sometimes be like a chasm. How do I breach this? Because I went into this like a little boy, and I'm a man, but I went into it with my instincts attuned to being 9 or 10.
Yeah. As
if I was going to get up again.
There was a particular moment that he struggled with a lot. He was in Iraq at the time, and a number of his people that he knew were being mortared about a mile away from his position. And he, being who he was, wanted to go charging in there to rescue his buddies, but he was ordered to stand down because it would have just led him, along with anyone who else would win him, into further danger. Yeah. So there's no sense in creating more bodies trying to save, those people. But of course, that's not a fun place to be in, right? Because he was under the impression and those instinctive pressure saying, you need to go out there no matter the cost.
Yeah.
No matter the cost, you got to go out there and do this. And that's how he felt. He obeyed orders, and he absolutely regretted it. He said he would prefer to have gone to jail for the rest of his life than have to deal with this guilt. Because he found out that 5 of the 6 men that were pinned down didn't make it, survive, and he carried that. Yeah. And so when he shared that story with me, I said, well, you didn't. They gave you orders to stay. You didn't really have much choice. And he said, you always have a choice. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I can't fight you, man. You do. And that sucks. And so I just backed away, and I said, let's just dwell in that together for a minute. And I want you to know that I'm here with you in that, and I'm not criticizing your interpretation.
Yeah.
Because it's just not, I didn't feel like, I go by feel a lot, and I didn't sense that was something that was going to budge.
Yeah.
If I tried to challenge that.
You do meet that, don't you, of people who've been through extreme things.
And also, form of illegitimate guilt, really, isn't it?
It is a form of illegitimate
carrying
guilt,
the guilt for something that he had no control over.
No, I mean, if he were to go back, and I don't recommend, and never recommend this particularly, but for
don't do this at home, folks.
Don't do this at home. Yeah, if he could go back to being a little boy again, playing with his friends, maybe in the woods somewhere, and a similar scenario, there was 5 or 6 of his mates, and in the imagination that's being acted out and shared, they're being pinned down, and he says, I've got to go and help them. He would, and he'd go, and he would either save them or he would die in the game trying to save them, which shows that the raw instinct intends the sacrifice.
Yeah.
And then when that's acted out in an adult, we get the split and the PTSD, and then the rationalization, if I can call it that without being, you know, disrespectful to the man, the rationalization, there's always a choice. Well, there isn't if instincts are pushing you, because they don't broker any opposition. They say, no, you do this because that's what we're for.
Yeah.
And the sacrifices for your friends, your comrades, your family, your tribe, wherever it might be, on the basis of genetic, you know, relationship. It's so ancient, it pushes people. But little boys die and get up again. But what they do, obviously, when they play it being killed, is to say, I did this for you, I'm one of you. This bonds us together. We're the warriors of the future. We will protect our tribe. We will sacrifice.
And that desire for tribal group identity and you know, it's extremely powerful in humans, because it's part of why why we exist. That's why we survive. We were able to do that, and especially when you start getting into the dynamics of intertribal conflicts and group selection and all that, the tribes that work together and are willing to sacrifice are the ones that survive to reproduce. So the only ones left are the people with those really strong, seemingly self-destructive instincts, but altruism has a self-destructive quality to it, and yet it works. Here we are, right?
Well, I was just going to add to that. So to be asked to stand down is to cap the instincts. I mean, even the expression to stand down suggests a lowering in status as well, doesn't it? Which you know, we know also too that anger and rage are linked to status and to a loss of status. So yes, you do. And to feel that kind of shame in front of himself for not acting instinctively must have been huge, unimaginable.
Very much so.
Yeah.
So that's where it would help. I mean, I joked before about, you know, not doing it, but under the right controlled situation to help a person access not childhood, except at a cognitive level, but beyond even an affect level, at a meaning level, to go back into the paleo instincts, the real meta instincts, the tribe. And as I often say to people, you might find yourself when you do this on the African savannah 200,000 years ago, and you look nothing like you do now, you know, because your ancestors were very different. But that tribal confirmation of you as a warrior, if you can bring that forward, then you will self-confirm and you'll close the gap. That you did honor, you honored the entire line back over the horizon, the fathers, way back. You've honored it, you've done it, you've completed, you did your best, nothing more could be done. But the bridge to that cognitively, and then maybe a little bit of an affect, is the child acting out the instinct of the ancestors of the tribe in preparation. And it isn't his fault what happened. It's not his fault.
You can't atone for something you haven't done or had full control over.
The illegitimate
it
guilt.
Is that,
like you say, Paul, because it's not real. You can't atone for
solve it.
Legitimate guilt, there's so many ways of dealing with that, which are socially agreed upon, and you know, whether it's you go to jail or you just say you're sorry, and anything between that. But illegitimate guilt is a logic loop, and repetition compulsion, you're trapped.
There's no way to deal with it,
unless it's meta instincts, because meta instincts provide meaning and say that's why you did it. You were there, you're one of us, all of us, we're with you. You did it. You're all right.
Well, again, that's
a level of meaning.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, that's what happened to Hercules in the Greek myth. He couldn't atone for what he did. You know, he killed his family, his wife and children. And no matter how many of the challenges he overcame and was successful in, he still felt that he couldn't atone for the guilt. And ultimately, that's why he sacrificed himself in the way that he did. So, you know, in that, again, is the suggestion of the need to transcend the guilt, to get beyond it. You know, that's in part is the message of the story, really, is to move beyond that human suffering and to reach a transcendent position on it, which can only really be achieved, like you say, Steve, by connection to meaning.
Yeah, that solves everything. Unfortunately,
it does. And as a form of consciousness, again, it attaches us to the meta instincts. That's the place that we need to go to correct for it.
Yeah. There's one danger with it that we've encountered over the years, is that when people access meta instinct and they get a cognition, if you, for want of a better word, of meaning that's non-cognitive reductive, and it's not affect based, it's transpersonal, transcendent.
Yeah.
That when people move back out of that state towards normal ego consciousness, they hit the affect again. There's this, they're going up the escalator and they hit it, and how that's managed is important. If it's managed negatively, they can collapse again and begin to fractionalize. Whereas if they understand that what they're actually hitting are the Panksepian instincts firing ahead, so all of the repressed needs, which are represented by the Panksepian affective 7 basic emotional systems, are fired ahead of the new adjustments of meaning. And as that moves back towards ego consciousness, with the aim of entering the self-concept and unpacking the metaphor provided by the meta instinct, you hit the affect, which is excitement, it's arousal, it's saying, yeah, let's go for this, we're okay now, let's go. But they hit the affect and it's, oh, that's an unpleasant experience. And then they don't get there, you know. So we find we have to prepare people for the reintegration process, which means how do we deal with the affect, which is fired ahead like an expanding rim of an explosion, and we go and we hit it, and oh God, I'm disturbed again. Yeah. And they think it's because I've gone into the mess. No, you've just hit the Panksepian ones on the way out.
Okay, so let me back up a second, because that's a lot to get your head around. So what you're saying is that the transcendent part, right? Can walk me through how they get to that point in your clinical work.
Well, there are no typical, well, there's a typical, but it's not an archetypal sort of way of doing it, if you know what I mean. It's not absolutely fixed, but the idea essentially is to use dissociation to generate a space that the ego can occupy and be safe within. To be safe within, it has to be separated from its cognitions, which stops some of the complexes, then separated from affect, because that's another kind of complex, another kind of consciousness.
It's kind of like a meditative state, well, transcendental meditation.
You can use that, but the difference with hypnosis is that the purpose of doing this is to, like going in a bath escape, you're going inside a safe vessel that can take you down or into another place. So on the way down, you will past the complexes, which are like these fish, you know, in the Mariana Trench, you know, with all these weird faces on them and teeth, floating around, but you pass through them, no attachments to them at all. The ego's in a safe, contained environment, and as it gets down closer, then it will pass through the realm of images, if you like, typal images, and then down to the level of these deep structure complexes. And they form, as I said earlier, dialectically. So they are learned, but they're not completely learned. It's James based, and that's what for us means that they're a complex and not an archetype.
Genetic guided learning, that kind of thing.
It's the product of the self or the genome's impression of the ego's adaptation, the narcissistic element. Now, what it actually said, you don't see yourself, you'll probably see some kind of representation that you've learned about from the culture. So if someone's into Star Wars, they might see Obi-Wan Kenobi or whatever his name is, or something like that will be presented as being the persona or the face of the doorway guardian for the meta instincts, because that the ego can link with. Once you get into the meta instinct, so it's different, you may not even get a narrative in the ordinary sense. As I often say to people, why would, you know, people from the African savannah 200,000 years ago speak English?
Right.
Well, much more likely, and this is again empirical, that the experience is one of deep meaning and a visceral connectedness to the group in a psychosocial sense, embedded within
a sense of oneness.
A oneness, but it is fundamentally real, and it's not ego conscious. It feels different.
Okay.
Now, once you're there and you get this sense of meaning, which is not affect consciousness, Panksepian, and it's not cognitive ego, it's that sense of, it gives you this feeling of, yes, that's it. I'm on my way back. I want to go back. I'm going forward now. I'm taking this with me. And then as you go, the Panksepian instincts, like artillery behind you, fire, bang. And they're on the way towards the ego, and we pass it, and poof, it hits us again. And it's like, what the hell's this? You know, nice. It's an arousal state, which is the libido as well as the pure Panksepian instinct attaching itself to the newly configured ego consciousness of itself before it reaches the self-concept and unpacks. In other words, it's momentum to act in the world and move a person beyond the state that they were in before. It's the required energy.
Yeah.
So how would you get someone like, we're talking here in a very abstract terms. So like if we were to say, take a particular person who was having a particular issue, whatever it is, what kind of issue would warrant this deep of a dive into the psyche?
Well, I agree with what you say, or the implication I think that is present, that we don't do this for everybody because it isn't necessary. Very often, what we call Jungian complexes, which are essentially split off elements of normal ego consciousness, they're most people's complexes most of the time. But if it's a severe lifespan development issue which requires someone to access another part of themselves, but
personality disorder, maybe?
Sorry? Personality.
Like a severe personality disorder, something like that?
It could be that, depending on whether this is so fundamentally genetic that you can't change them, or whether it's a defensive adaptation to a terrible environment. That's a different, etiology, really, of personality disorder, in our view. Yeah. Or it might just be somebody who has been so severely traumatized or hurt, or has simply lost connection with their genome, or has never had a conscious connection to it, and has only felt the arousal state of instinctive pressure pushing on them. They need to have a context that says, you're okay, you have an ancestry, and we're interested in you being well and moving forward and fulfilling your optimal adaptation to life.
Okay, so severe cases of anomie or disconnection, which, gosh, there's a lot of that going around.
Yeah, in the individual, it's basically the solution to a severe individuation neurosis, as we would classify that, rather than a simple one, a relatively simple one.
Well, it would work for somebody, as we were saying before, PTSD or OCD or something like that, where they're stuck in some kind of ruminatory or behavioral loop. It would just take them to a place where the thing about the meta instincts is, where I think when you're there, there's a kind of a complete certainty, isn't there, about the meaning of the situation that you find yourself in. The other thing too, I was thinking about, Stu, is that it can arise spontaneous in dare I say, in relatively well adapted normal people.
Called upon an ass, as Jung said.
I mean, you had an experience yourself recently like that. I mean, it was in a public place.
It was very difficult to control.
It was. You were fine on the descent, taking the lift, the accelerator, the lift down to.
And I was overwhelmed on the way back.
On the way back out.
And even though I knew that I would be, or could be overwhelmed on the way out, I had to anchor my ego's position. I had to give a real-time narrative to Pauline. Like saying, I'm trying to stay sane. I'm not doing a very good job. Emotion,
it was actually hard to speak.
I couldn't speak, and that was really interesting because there was no way I could associate it to the linguistic elements of the ego. The affect was so strong that it had been mobilized by the and it was spontaneous. It was, but not. From the perspective of the ego, it appeared to be, but when we look back, there were several indications that something was brewing, and I found myself following a path of associations spread out like spikes over days, which generated it like a trap in a way. And I was pulled into it, and I thought, I'm going to have to go all the way. I've got to go all the way into this, because I'll do something inappropriate in a public place and soak everybody with projectile tears, because the effect was strong. And got in there, got the flash of understanding, felt okay, but I'm on my way up again. And then the emotion came in, which meant I have to do, and I thought, I can't, because this is not the right place. There was a mismatch between context.
it was frustrating because having had that flash of understanding, you wanted to share it,
yes,
but were incapable of doing
talk.
so. Yeah.
And it makes sense that you would have to re-engage with the emotions, because part of the initial process is to disengage from them, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And they're intended to travel together, but if you're able to separate them out so you can get a deeper insight, sooner or later you got to come back. And they got to plug back in, and then all hell breaks loose. But if you're ready for it, I guess, then you're okay. But
Happy intensity.
yeah.
It was weird. It was a really weird experience because it's happened before. I've seen it with so many other people, but it got me, you know, it got me by stealth.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess I better wrap things up here. But fantastic discussion.
Thank you, Professor. It's been wonderful speaking to you.
It's been great. It's been great. I can't wait to get this one up on the channels.
We'll do that.
See what folks think.
Get this out to you. I'll get it out to you directly if you wish, and then you can edit it and get it out whenever you want. And it'll probably be next week now, because James's wedding anniversary is coming, I think, Friday.
Well, that's important.
He said he'll be unable to edit anything until next week. So
understandable.
But feel free to put it out.
Okay. All right. Cool.
I'll
do that.
Wonderful again, and really look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah. Oh yes, we'll be back.
Brilliant. Thank you and blessings.
Like all right.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.